Here's something I know for a fact. The older you get, the more you tend to repeat yourself. And I know I'm going to be repeating myself about how to bend hinges because I have this vague memory of having demonstrated how to bend hinges in my first book, The Door Hanger's Handbook. In my second book, Finished Carpentry, that was published by JLC, I did it on my website years and years ago. I did it again in This is Carpentry. I think I might have published an article on it even. God, I think I've probably covered the same material 5 or 6 times. But the cool thing about Instagram is there's a whole bunch of folks that have never read any of that stuff. And here's an opportunity for all of you to get it right from the Schaefer brothers, because that's where I learned how to do this. And it's pretty simple. Let's take a look at this door first. Right here is just about right, but as you look across the top of the door here, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and I'm right in here. My goodness, I can get the heel of my wrench in here, so it's way too big there. And look down here. This gap is way too tight. That door is almost jam bound. There's probably only about a 1/16 of an inch there. So it'd be nice if we could spread this hinge and move the door further away from the jam right here. The gap on the strike side at the bottom of the jam here, it is even bigger than it was at the top. I could probably get 2 inches in there. So if we spread that hinge over there and move the door in this direction away from the hinge jam toward the strike jam, that'll make this gap smaller too. Now this gap here, which is way too big, we can adjust by spreading the hinge on the top of the door. So what did we just do? We just looked at the whole picture. There are 2 ways to bend hinges. There's the squeeze and there's the spread. I'm going to show you both in just a second. But before you can do either one, you've got to look at the whole picture, because a door is a rectangle within the rectangle of the jam. And you want to be able to move the rectangle of the door inside the rectangle of the jam. And you have 2 key pivot points to do that from, the bottom hinge and the top hinge. You can spread them or you can squeeze them. That means if I take that hinge over there and I spread it and I move this door down at the bottom here toward the strike jam, it's going to also raise the top of the door, the head of the door, and get it closer to the head jam, which in this case is awesome. Now, if there wasn't much of a gap between the top of the door and the head jam on the strike side, that might not be such a good thing, because if I spread that hinge a lot, and I close this gap up, and there's no gap above the door at the head jam on the strike side, then the top of the door is going to probably start to rub on the head jam. And that's why you have to look at the whole picture before you bend any hinges. Here's a stack of hinges I just grabbed out of my cabinet. Yeah, they're kind of old. I've had them hanging around for a while. But I'll pull one box. And let's open this thing up. These are brand new. There's the screws. Here's the screws. Here's the hinges still wrapped in plastic. Let's pull the plastic off of both of them so we can take a good look at these things. Because hinges are kind of funny. People think they're identical. I mean, one to the next. And really, you pull them out of the box and they aren't at all. I learned this from Alan Royal Schaefer. And it's something all of us need to learn. Hinges work because one of the leaves, and actually both of them, are bent just a little bit. This one's got the swag in it right here where the leaf is bent at the knuckle on every single one of these knuckles. Check this out and you'll see what I mean. This hinge is bent right there. That's the swag in the hinge. If there was no swag in the hinge, then the leaves would touch each other and the hinge would be hinge bound or leaf bound. So let's look at this. If you look at the distance, the space between the 2 leaves right there, and I'll get in as close as I can, you'll see it's probably about a 1/16 of an inch. But if you look at the gap between the leaf on this, oh, this is great. Look at this. You look between these 2 leaves and there's hardly any gap at all. Maybe you can get a piece of paper in there, and that's it. So this hinge is going to space the door a little bit more off the jam than this hinge. So if this were the top hinge, you'd have a bigger gap between the door and the jam than you would at the bottom hinge at this hinge. I hope you understand what I'm talking about. This means that not every time, but fairly fairly often, you got to make minor adjustments in the hinges to make sure that your gaps are equal and consistent all the way around the door, especially on the hinge side. So here's how you do it. There are two ways to adjust a hinge. One is by spreading it, and you spread a hinge once it's attached to the jamb in the door with a nail set. I just take my nail set, I stick it right inside the hinge and push it hard against the barrel of the hinge, and then close the door on it gently in 2 or 3 places. And that way it opens up the space between the two leaves. Now you don't want to do this with a bright brass hinge or a soft brass hinge because it'll leave a big dent. If you want to open up a hinge like that, boy, you could use maybe a block of wood or the butt end of a shim, but even that probably wouldn't work that well. More than likely, you're going to have to back those hinges out and shim them between the jamb and the back of the hinge, or between the back of the hinge and the door with like a piece of laminate or something. Just a little bit at a time until you space that door off the jamb a little bit more. That's the spread. Then there's the squeeze. The squeeze is pretty simple too. I use a crescent wrench for this. I take the crescent wrench and I put it on the knuckle right there, and I bend the hinge by pulling mine on a crescent wrench. Now let me show you how that's done, because it's a little bit tricky. If you put your crescent wrench on the wrong knuckles, you'll make a mess and the hinge will be leaf bound immediately. If you leave the pin in the hinge, chances are the hinge is going to end up being leaf bound too. Because you just want to bend the knuckles that are attached to the door. You never want to bend the knuckles that are attached to the jamb. Let's look at that real close. When I want to squeeze a hinge, the first thing I do is I drive the pin up so it's just engaging the top 2 knuckles. Now you can use a nail set to do this. You can use a little putty knife. You can take a putty knife and stick it right in between the pin and the hinge. Give it a smack, it'll separate them, and then take the putty knife and drive the pin up. There's so many different ways to remove pins. There's even a custom tool they make to do that. They also make a tool for squeezing hinges, but I've never found one that works on every single hinge. So I drive this pin up until it's just engaging the top 2 knuckles. I don't want it engaging any of these knuckles down here. And since we're looking down here, notice that this leaf that's attached to the door has 3 knuckles on it. The leaf that's attached to the jamb has 2 knuckles. I want to bend the leaf that's attached to the door. And when I do, I want to bend it in this direction. I know. It doesn't make any sense. It's like cutting crown molding upside down and backwards. But think about this. When you're squeezing a hinge, that's not what we want to do to this door. First of all, we want to spread this hinge for this door. I just want to show you how to squeeze a hinge first before we spread it. When you're squeezing a hinge, you want to bend the knuckles in this direction toward the strike side so that when you put the pin back in and engage both knuckles, you'll be actually drawing the whole door back toward the hinge jamb. And that is what squeezing a hinge is all about. Moving the door from the strike side to the hinge side. So I take my crescent wrench, I tighten it up on the barrel attached to the door, and I give it a tweak. Now, this top one's a little bit tough to bend because the pin is engaging the top 2 knuckles. But when I come down to the next knuckle, the center knuckle, it bends real easy. And then all I have to do is bend this last one and bend it real careful, because it'll bend easier than anything because there's no metal on the bottom side of it. Then you'll notice now that this knuckle right here is no longer flush. It's proud of this knuckle here, and this one's proud of this knuckle. So when I drive my pin back in, it'll straighten up that whole hinge. As it comes down through these knuckles, it's pulling the hinge back, the hinge on the door, back toward the jamb. So if you have too big of a gap on the hinge side, you can squeeze your hinge and move the door back toward the hinge side. In other words, if you have too tight of a gap on the strike side, you can squeeze your hinge and move the door back toward the hinge jamb. But that's not what we want to do here. I've closed up this gap right here, which is exactly what we don't want to do. We want to open that gap on this door. So to spread a hinge, you're going to open up the door and use your nail set. We'll go around the other side and I'll show you what I mean. Now do this really gently. If you do this too hard, you'll rip the hinge screws right out the back of the door on a hollow core door for sure, or you'll rip them right out of the jamb. Either way, you'll have a mess on your hands. But that will move the door away from the hinge jamb toward the strike jamb, which is exactly what we have to do with this door, especially since we squeezed that hinge when we didn't need to. And what we really need to do is spread that bottom hinge a lot more. So here at the bottom hinge, I'm going to do the same thing. I'll put my nail set up against the barrel of the hinge, and then I'll pull that door against that nail set, and I'll do it like in 3 different places. And I'm giving it a pretty good tug there. And I'm slowly moving that door right over to the strike jamb, a little bit at a time. There we go. So let's see what this thing looks like now. Ooh, look at this. Now we got a nice consistent gap beneath the bottom hinge, and before there was hardly any gap there at all. The door was almost jam bound. So up at the top here, by spreading this hinge, after we squeezed it first, then we spread it, we increased this gap just a little bit. And by spreading the bottom hinge, we've actually straightened this gap up considerably. It's almost even across the top of the door now. And this gap here is a little bit tighter than it was, but we could still spread this hinge a little bit more, bring the door over toward this jamb a bit more, and spread the bottom hinge too, just a tiny bit more, just to lift up the top of the door on the strike side. So that should teach you something really important about adjusting and bending hinges. Not just, the difference between the squeeze with a crescent wrench and the spread with the nail set, but even more importantly, how to do this very, very gently and slowly. Don't try to make huge corrections right out the gate, because if you do, you're going to yank screws out or something and make a mess. It can be harder to clean up the mess. And besides, you want to move the door slowly so you can adjust it into exactly the right position. If you want to learn more about hanging doors, and I mean setting pre-hungs and hanging doors from scratch, check out the Door Hangers DVD. There's a link to it right below on the YouTube channel. And before you leave, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. I'm getting old. I need all the support I can get.